Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth panel of the Broadcast Sport Tech Forum, Tech Innovation Forum. It's a real privilege to be with you guys today. My name is John Elmes. I'm the international editor at Broadcast, but I do cross over from time to time onto the Broadcast Sport team. And it's a real, as I say, a privilege to be part of this production panel that we have for you today. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of what the panel will hope to cover, and then our esteemed panelists. We're all pretty aware of what's been going on in 2020, and this is why we're doing a virtual panel as opposed to a live panel. But the impact of the coronavirus has been obvious on the production side of the whole industry, the whole production industry, and no more in sport, especially when live sport was cancelled within the UK and other parts of the world earlier this year. So that's just a bit of a teeing up. I'm now going to introduce my panelists. We have with us Nick Moody, an executive producer at Sunset and Vine. Nick has many years of experience in the sports production industry. He tells me, topping 3 decades. He says at Sunset and Vine, his recent programming has included the production of the Amazon Premier League matches in Project Restart. So he's got first-hand experience of the kind of post-COVID-19 world, and he's also leading the team that will be delivering 22 live Premier League games in December. Also with us, we have Jemma Archer from Whisper. Gemma's a senior producer at Whisper. She joined in October 2019, and she brought with her to Whisper over 14 years of experience, sports production experience, working for major broadcasters, including ITV and beIN Sports. At Whisper, she looks after their Whisper's women's football portfolio, i.e. the women's football show on the BBC, the Women's FA Cup, and England Lionesses international fixtures. She's also involved with Whisper's creative commercial projects. And last but not least, we have Matt Beal. He's disappeared from me on my screen, but I believe he's going to be coming up soon. Matt works for Aurora Media Worldwide. He's been involved with the company, which is a fully integrated content agency, since its inception 7 or 8 years ago. But for the last 2 years, he's been an executive producer in-house at Aurora Media Worldwide. Cast your mind back to March when lockdown 1 hit us and all live sports were cancelled. Obviously, there's a lot of live sports on that show reel. How did you react, and what steps did you take to try and minimize the impact on your business?
Well, Whisper as a whole reacted pretty quickly, and I think first and foremost it was a case of the fact of bearing in mind that contracts hadn't been cancelled. It was just everything was on ice, everything was postponed. So I think the business as a whole, it was just about making sure that that when things did start off again, that they had the people in place, kept the existing infrastructure, that everything was good to go, so that we could all hit the ground running again as and when things started. So job retention was key for that reason, and immediately people went on to part-time hours. That changed a little bit when furlough came in, and then you had this kind of hybrid way of working where you had some aspects of the business that could continue, and then you had others, especially where live sport was involved, which ground to a complete halt. And therefore there was a mix of furlough and part-time hours during that time. But overall, it was about staff retention being quite key. There were productions that continued during that time. There's lots of commissions for people had to fill their schedules. So there was still productions going on during that time. We had a look back at the 66 World Cup final as a remote production. Some documentaries for Wales Rugby continued, but certainly for the WSL, which I look after, that completely ground to a halt. And then we kind of had this kind of semi-lockdown where COVID testing came into place, and then that brought back the Premier League and that brought back the WSL. and then cricket was able to resume, which we did highlights for the BBC. So it kind of, there was a sudden kind of halt as to proceedings, but then gradually things kind of started to kick back up again.
Sure, absolutely. And Nick, if I go to you, were your experiences similar to Gemma's at Sunset and Vine? You know, how did you react to the whole situation, and what steps did you take to minimise the impact on your business?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. I mean, exactly like Jemma, really, and all our colleagues across the industry. I mean, a large proportion of Sunset and Vine's business is live sport, and when that stopped, our revenue dropped off a cliff. So we had to do whatever we could to protect ourselves and the staff, and make sure that we were still in a good, healthy position when the live sport did return. So we took advantage of the government's furlough scheme. We did place a large number of people onto that. And those of us that were left and were busy on various different projects, we all took sizable pay cuts. And as a result of that, when everything did come back, we were in a position to come, get everybody back very quickly, and as we'll come on to, be in a position to service all our clients and federations, as well as we possibly could do, because we'd managed to protect everybody. So look, really tough 6 or 7 months, but we're all grateful for live sport to be coming back, and that we don't have to keep watching panels looking at recorded games, aren't we?
Absolutely. I'm going to come back to Jemma, because you mentioned some of the productions that you were able to work on, or stuff that you were able to work on during lockdown remotely. But Matt, from Aurora Media Worldwide's perspective, what were the steps that you took at your company to kind of minimize the impact on your business, and also then maybe lead into that with, were you able to work on any productions during the lockdown? And we can go back to the other panelists.
Yeah, I think it's much the same route as Whisper and Sunset. We put a large amount of people on the furlough scheme. The management took a pay cut, and in line with probably the percentage of the furlough scheme for some sort of parity inside the business. And I think, and then we just put some operational measures in place. It was to move edit suites and media and people, because we said live productions moving at that point, some post-production shows. So it was about maintaining some continuity, particularly for our partners and clients, as a kind of operational movement went on in the background. It sometimes takes a little bit of effort to move few terabytes of media overnight. So I think everyone faced the same challenges, and it's all about staff stepping up. I think we across the board, everyone was so proud of how everyone came together through crisis meetings, and then basically just got on straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned kind of some of you touched on some of the projects you did. What were you able to do any productions during the lockdown period, which you were able to carry on whilst all locked down and remotely working?
Yeah. Well, we, as you may know, we work with Formula E as the host broadcast partner on that. Formula E had some commitments to deliver a level of broadcasting to their broadcast partners, to their rights holders. And what we've done quite quickly was we built a portfolio of suggestion of ideas to do along the same lines as the BBC done with Wimbledon or the Euros done. And it was perhaps a myriad of archive-based programming. Formula E themselves fired up a gaming property, which we co-proed with the guys there. And I think across the shows we made something like hours for broadcast content. And then what was very interesting is they quickly we worked with LDS, who's one of our partner companies on the project, and segmented all the products we made. So it was a digital prospect at exactly the same time as being a broadcast prospect. So it really was everyone coming together and working the best route forward very quickly.
Sure. Jemma, you mentioned that certain aspects of what you do day to day were completely stopped because live sport was cancelled. Did you then, because that moved away, were you then as you referenced, going on to other productions, put onto other shows that you or pieces of content that you were able to then work on for the during lockdown?
Yeah, for a little while, came a point where even, you know, so I started doing a lot of forward planning on certain tournaments and things which are coming up. But because my role is so intrinsically tied with live sport, it came a point where there was just nothing more physically I could do. But the key thing was when the COVID testing came into place with the Premier League, and then that extended to the WSL, and that's when we could get back into production again. And certainly on the WSL, to a certain extent, we already had an existing remote model, so there was much we could do to start planning and getting things back into place again for the new season. And actually what I found is that certainly is that before we've gone into the second lockdown, is that there's probably been a backlog of fixtures and of sporting. I've been pretty non-stop since we've kind of all got back, because, you know, there was the resumption, for example, of the Women's FA Cup. So that's where the benefit of having kept staff and kept that retention came back into play, because when things did start up, it was quite an intense fixture list.
Yeah. So you kind of, I suppose, you and your colleagues anticipated that there would be a return. It just was when, and just had to have the staff and the capabilities to deal with it when they came around, right? Exactly. Yeah. And Nick, obviously we've just spoken about football with Jemma. That was a quite high profile, but Sunset and Vine do a lot of cricket, and the whole cricket season was completely disrupted over the summer and truncated. What productions were you involved with when you after lockdown? It's all settled into lockdown.
Yeah, well, we actually managed to do the Caribbean Premier League just before we went live. Jemma and I were discussing some of her colleagues who are now out in New Zealand and currently being in quarantine. We had to do exactly the same thing for the Caribbean Premier League, and we sent a team out there who had to stay in a hotel in the Caribbean for 2 weeks. I'd argue that sounds quite good, but I mean, I think probably once you're locked down in a hotel, maybe it's not quite as glamorous as it sounds. We were fortunate, when we had the first lockdown. One of our large contracts is with BT Sport. They, like every other broadcaster, wanted a huge amount of content. So our S&V BT Sport production team were creating magazine programs every week for them, live magazine programs. So that was the early kickoff, an hour and a half on a Saturday morning, with everybody in their own homes. The producers, directors, vision mixers. I mean, it was a huge operation, and I think we'll come on to a little bit more, how we went about all that. We did similar shows on rugby as well, and actually one of the sort of the probably the more interesting and sort of slightly quirky things is we did free live events for Zwift, the indoor cycling app, which sort of really took off when everybody was locked down and in their own homes. And we've got a bit of a relationship with them. We did a program last year, which was live on BT Sport, and we produced a couple of those. One of them was on in association with Team Ineos, the ex-Team Sky, as we used to know them. So there was a Zwift Ineos event that we did on Easter Sunday, and then there was another one that we did at the beginning of June, and then we also did a Zwift celebrity event, which featured Kevin Peterson and Freddie Flintoff, Ollie Murs, all of those type of guys in their home. So we produced things like that, and obviously we were also on the business development side. That kind of continued. So in actual fact, it was a pretty full-on summer in terms of pitching for new business. As I think everybody will be aware, we managed to secure the rights to be the host producers for the Commonwealth Games, and that was really fortuitous because it meant we could bring some people that were just about to go onto furlough. We could bring them back, planning on sort of 19 sports and over 2,000 hours of coverage. There's a lot of planning going into that already. We've won a couple of contracts with Prime Video that we've been busy working on for most of lockdown. So one of those is to produce the Champions League in Germany next year. So I've been very busy on that. And then we're producing the Autumn Nations Cup Rugby, which starts this weekend for them. So lots of things going on in the summer, which, all good for the future, and just meant that actually a few of us were sort of ticking over. And, personally speaking, I like nothing more than actually getting my teeth into something rather than just sitting at home with twiddling my fingers. So, I think, in the end, it was a lot better than it could have been.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is another thing that's happened on the kind of the whole of the production industry on my side, more on TV, less on sport, is that the lockdown period happened to be quite a big area of time for development and searching out new businesses. So it's interesting that you say that. Of course, when the production came back, when production did come back to live sport, did come back to it, we were in this situation where there's lots of kind of COVID restrictions needed, and I just wanted to get your perspective on what your companies did to kind of adaptations to make to accommodate the COVID restrictions that we all came back to when live sport returned. And we're going to start with Matt, because Matt, you have a kind of a presentation of what Aurora Media Worldwide, which you're going to show before we kind of go on and tease out some like examples and kind of bits from that. So we're just going to tee that up, and we'll once that's done, we'll discuss it in further. So bear with us.
Cool. What can everyone see here? Can you guys see the picture of Tempelhof?
Yeah.
Ah, cool. Okay, so we just want to do a couple of slides, and it's just some production stills, really. We had two kind of major propositions in lockdown, and what Formula E decided to do, they're in a really bad place. Their kind of mandate is city centre racing, so it's the worst place to go and try and stand up live sport in the middle of cities and shut down cities with lockdown. So they took the championship, and we went to Berlin for 9 days. And in that 9 days, we ran over half the season. And we done 6 races across the 9 days. And this is just a couple of slides to show a few examples. So what we've done is the whole of the event was drifted into zones to go in line with British and German COVID-19 restrictions. So we had the track zone we can see here, the paddock zone, TV compounds, and another paddock here for the support series. And during the whole event, everybody stayed not only within their zones, they were fenced off, but they also bubbled inside relevant hotels and were shipped between. And there was a testing program coming in between. So everyone got tested 3 times coming into the event, 3 times on event, and then post-event. And on the way in daily, everyone was subject to temperature checks, and we were all bibbed and put masks across the whole way through. We had to take some radical steps. You see here in the top right that we, for the first time, built a big studio, and we used this as a sort of presentation position as well as a podium position. So on the big screen, we're able to bring in guests who weren't on site, fans, and we ran a thing called a Mondo, which is kind of interactive social media collection of all live social media at the same time, harvesting from Twitter and TikTok and YouTube, etc., which our commentators and presenters kind of interacted with the drivers. And we were for the first time running a co-production, so we were reduced numbers in crew because the whole site was down to 900 people, where normally it's about 3,000 for an event, including the teams. And we split between Ealing. I think actually, Whisper, you were next door to us doing the one at that point.
Yeah.
And obviously on site in Berlin. So that's the kind of focus of the full host broadcast, and allowed us to put out the English language broadcast, the full host broadcast, and all the associated details to go with that. And just quickly at the same time, we went into planning with our partners at Goodwood. And I think the difference between Goodwood and Formula E is Formula E wanted to carry on some continuity of their product. As much as possible, they wanted to carry on the same product, deliver to the same spec to the broadcasters, and maintain that relationship to the fans and their clients. Where Goodwood were very interesting. They took what is quite a traditional rights holders proposition, and I think moved to a kind of media owner perspective. So if those of you know Festival of Speed and Revival, they decided to drop that model. Obviously, you can't have 100,000 people on site over 3 days. And they built a proposition where we ran called Speed Week, where we were live for 3 days. We had 2 streams up simultaneously. So we had 50 hours of streaming, which is a brave thing to do. And then we had another 8 hours broadcast across ITV. So we had 3 2-hour stints and then some highlight shows. And inside that model, we built 6 fields of play. We had over 50 cameras on site. We had multiple crew. Again, it ran a kind of bubbling process. And we had 9 talent, etc. So we saw one broadcaster or one of our clients wishing to maintain the status quo, and another wishing to develop a product in a completely new way. And it was 2 different responses which we partnered with them to achieve. So I'll just stop sharing there.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much for that, Matt. And I'll just quickly, you've elucidated what kind of social distancing measures that you had to introduce and working with different government guidelines, which is tough. It was interesting that you mentioned you brought in the fact that Jemma was working next door. Jemma, I just want to go on to you in terms of working, knowing that you're working side by side with someone socially distancing. How are you socially distancing yourself and ensuring you are socially distanced from Matt? What kind of? I suppose there aren't that many places where you can do much live sport production, and Ealing Studios was one of those ones.
Yeah, we had, so there was, at Ealing Studios, there was actually a separate wing which we were put into with a larger gallery, and that enabled social distancing between myself, the director, and stats and PAs and whatnot. And in terms of the other changes, certainly at Ealing, at the studios, commentators, for example, instead of being in one booth, would be in 2 booths, and they'd have a camera put inside each booth so that they could still see each other and maintain some kind of natural interaction. Obviously, there's mask wearing and social distancing, and literally just physically less people in any one space at any given time. Production meetings, which instead of happening all together in a room, are happening outside, or you're breaking them down and doing them, with a few people at a time. On site at OBs, you had to follow pretty strict COVID-19 protocols. So at that point, you're getting into the management of people's movement. So there were red, amber, green zones, for example, that you could move in and out of around, which were very, very strict. And I think, and again, just, not having, for example, on an OB, you'd be used to having maybe, your graphics, your stats operator, your PRO operator. And that filtered through even with guests, with what you see in the visuals, having to maintain social distancing between guests. All of a sudden, where you might have had a presenter plus 3 guests, a director's really having to think about how things are being framed, how things look. You're having to think about, as a producer, dropping guests sometimes in and out so it doesn't look too messy. So you had to kind of really alter the way that you kind of see things, and your workflow changed as a result. And certainly, physical distancing, I think, has had quite a big play on things. And even recently on the Women's FA Cup, we had Tony Bellew, the boxer, in our opener, for example. So he was in a bubble, so he had to be kind of filmed in that bubble. And then you had myself at the office in Kew. We were making an opener, a music opener. You had the AP cutting it in Cardiff at home. You had the editor at his home. You had the graphic designer at his home. So it's really just it's adapting, but it's very different way of working, and making everything feel on air cohesive and whole, when in actuality it's almost like a jigsaw, as it were, in getting everything together, has been quite a challenge. So that's in a nutshell kind of how.
Yeah. Just quickly before, and then I'm going to bring Nick into this question as well. Did the having to kind of accommodate guests and staff, did that affect how many staff you could bring to an event, and to basically say you'd have a full team, but some of you might have had to be doubling up, and then what's the knock-on effect of production workflows with that if you're having to minimize the amount of staff you have?
Yeah, certainly an awareness of, you know, whether we need, for example, as many APs with us on site on trucks, you know, that did come into play because of the social distancing. Then it meant that there was only a certain number of people we could have on site. So, you know, to a certain extent, did it increase people's workloads? Yes and no, but it was, you know, there's just had to be a huge amount of forward thinking about the workflow and how you'd manage things, knowing that you had sometimes less physical bodies with you. So so that did change kind of your working week structure in the build up to a show or you know, an OB change, because you're having to factor in the fact that you've got X amount less people with you on site.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Nick, just you were nodding along when Jemma was describing it. Seems like you had a similar experience. What kind of did you do, and did you have the similar experience of having to kind of compartmentalize your teams and to make sure that you had the right number of guests on and social distancing and all that?
Yeah, absolutely, John. You know, very similar experience, and not just for me and the Amazon Prime Video productions, but across the board for our teams that were producing football for BT Sport and the rugby as well, all very much remote. And I think when we come on to it, maybe on one of your later questions, I've got a sort of, and as Jemma was describing the workflows as well, I think one of the disadvantages of the environment that we're currently in is I think it's a lot more transactional, and it's much harder for creativity to flow when you are all so disparate. But I think if we come on to that as probably one of your later questions, but I think one of the advantages of what we've experienced is we've been able to have some lovely platforms in stadiums because there's no crowd there. And so, you know, when we came back with Prime Video, rather than going onto the pitch side, as we know that we can do, which actually when you are in different zones, as Jemma described, you can't be that near to the players. So our press director, Richard Day, decided, right, what about if we build a platform in the stand and create a space that is, I mean, it's not unique, but it looked really good. And we did that sort of in Project Restart, and you know, it was a nice idea, and lo and behold, everybody's now doing it, and that's great, because I think it does create some nice environments, and the BBC did it for their big FA Cup matches at Wembley, and similarly BT Sport as well, and you know, it just creates something different. So that I think is something that we have been able to do. Obviously, there's no crowds in the stadium. We'd much prefer there was, but that's given us the opportunity to be able to do that. And yes, I think the exactly the same. We've had to have everybody remote. We you know, again, I think where it's a little bit difficult is you can't have your stats guy sitting with graphics anymore. So if you want to be populating the live matches with lots of great stats, it's that bit harder, especially for the Prime Video production when we're not doing it week in, week out. We like Sky or BT, we come in. Normally it's coming in December with 20 or 22 fixtures like we have this year, and we come in for a very short period of time. So that's a real challenge in itself, to be able to come in a short period and deliver a very slick, well-produced production that everybody goes, oh, we're used to that. That looks nice. That doesn't feel out of kilter. If you've got everybody in different positions, that's that much harder. We certainly found that in the summer that, you know, putting with people in lots of different areas, you have to think differently, and it does make it a little bit more challenging.
Sure, absolutely. Just before I bring in Matt to go on to our next, you mentioned one of the disadvantages. Just talk about some of the things that you've had to harness within this slightly strange period that we find ourselves in, that have been positive and you think will carry on into the long term. And match them with the stuff that you found it more transactional, which you didn't like as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the transactional thing I talk was, as Jemma was describing, the way that we are now having to work and just how we're having to do this, everything on a Zoom call. You know, our production meetings now every Tuesday are on Zoom, and however impressive this is. And obviously very good for Zoom share price. We're much better as humans being together. And I think for productions, I always believe that, and have advocated, if we can all be in a nice big meeting room and throwing ideas around, it doesn't matter whether it is a production secretary, an AP, or the director and executive producer. Everybody's got really good, valid ideas about what we should be putting into programs. And personally, I like nothing more than to be having a production meeting where everybody can share those concepts and ideas. And I really miss that. And I think, you know, that's the disadvantage of not being able to be in the office as well, to be able to share, have that camaraderie. And sometimes I think just having to do it over conference calls online is really hard, and that's why I'm saying I think it's more transactional. I think it's personally, I think it stifles creativity a little bit. I don't think that's and I think people are adapting to their programming accordingly as well. One of the disadvantages is obviously for the Premier League, we can't now, because of lockdown, we can't get into the clubs and the training grounds and interview players as we have been able to before, or take them off to do something. So you have to think about our openers and features. We're going to have to do those differently, and sometimes that works. But by and large, I think you adapt and you just maybe have a bit more chat and a bit more analysis in your build-ups, as opposed to those type of pieces. So that's what I'm saying about everything being transactional, and that's what I find a little bit frustrating at the moment. As human beings, we love to interact with each other, and that's where I think the creativity is lacking a little bit.
Absolutely, and I think that is pretty much a universal view. I think that in any industry, let alone TV production, where interpersonal relationships are key. Matt, just picking up on Nick's point, were there any positive changes that you've made that you think that will go forward into the new normal when we return to what semblance of normality we had pre-COVID? Are there any things that you've taken and harnessed that you'll keep for the future?
Yeah, I think it's a confidence in the tech. I think the lockdown and the post-lockdown world in COVID has expedited the emergence of remote working. We've all been working in some way or another, but we've all had to push that a little bit further, put that a little bit more remote in, put AR graphics in remotely, and work with people in different countries, let alone different parts of the UK. And I think we've grown confident using that. And I think that's a big plus moving forwards, because that will release capital, which will release creativity to come in again. And I think also the other learnings we're finding is coming back to a central hub sometimes means you've got a little bit more firepower behind you in terms of servers and what you can do kind of graphically. Whereas if you're lumping Unreal engines around the world, it's all freight, it's all carbon. And I think that will increase creativity. And I think the final thing is, if you put that next to, and what I've been impressed by is the media owners and the rights holders, their flexibility, I think, in this, what is a short term, has been huge. And the ability to move their product to reach where the audience are. We've seen huge growth in streaming propositions and audience moving to streaming. Some of the demographics of 50 plus people taking up SVOD is quite large, which we didn't see before. And we've seen audience figures going up. So I think the two models of tech and the ability of the propositions to shift creatively, that's been a bright future. I think there's always a silver lining.
Sure, absolutely. we're running out of time. There was a question from the audience which I want to ask, and I think I'm going to integrate a question that I had for for you all on the panel. The audience questions comes from Sam Tung. He's asked, what is the general outlook for sports production in the immediate and midterm future? Are you finding your partners are cutting back or perhaps needing more content? And what of the forced innovations are you likely to carry on in the future? I mean, you've already touched on that, Matt. Jemma, I want to come to you with that question first. And I think I'm just going to add to that, what do you, will the sports production industry be able to survive on the same scale if lockdown continues into 2021, far into 2021?
Yes, I think it will, because two reasons. I think it's just the kind of audience appetite for sport doesn't go away. In fact, I'd say it's probably increased during this lockdown period. And whilst there's that appetite, I think it will fuel the continuation of sport to continue, especially now that there are certain processes in place which is allowing live sport to go ahead. And the fact that broadcasters have been quite nimble and quite flexible in looking at their models, kind of decentralizing them and reacting to what the new market is. So I think that will continue. Definitely, it's a case of still then, we've gone past the point where we're looking at COVID style filming for things. We want to all produce quality premium shows. So at the heart of that is essentially going back to the drawing board, thinking out the box a lot of the time on how we can really kind of draw out creativity and innovation in what we do. So, for example, at Whisper, the Russian Grand Prix, when they went into lockdown, instead of going into like a flat state studio, they decided to take the presentation to the Red Bull racing paddock and did it from there, and then kind of got behind the scenes access that you wouldn't normally get, which viewers loved. So it's kind of thinking of different ways in which to do things that, that we can't necessarily do now. So I do think, I think it's quite a bright future. I think technology has enabled us to kind of work in different ways, and that's all positive. And I think everyone's got a will to make it work as well. And I think it's, a bit of a slightly different note, but I think it's so important for the kind of nation's psyche, as it were, that sport continues. It brings families, friends, people together, that I think there's a vested interest from all parties, public, governing bodies, production companies, to kind of keep things going.
Absolutely. I mean, you've introduced something that's really interesting about the importance of sport, and I suppose we've been quite lucky that in the second lockdown, sports production has been allowed to continue under, to make sure that we still have that sport. Just using that as a counterpoint, though, Nick, you said that there were some, we all want to be able to interact on the ways we did before. Therefore, do you think that it can continue in the way that you've been forced to make programming now, or will there have to be a sea change and go back to how it was before to allow sport to realise its full capacity?
Yeah, it's not going to go back, John, because what has happened during the summer is we've had a huge push for distributed remote production, and both Sky and BT are now conducting huge remote productions, and that's not going to change. And I think that's good for the industry. I was at High Wycombe on Saturday while BT were transmitting the Everton-Manchester United match. Jamie Oakford, the match director, was in High Wycombe. The match is in Liverpool, and that is the future. Him and Stu Scott, the vision mixer, and all the EVS ops are in the remote production gallery in High Wycombe. The presentation team is in Stratford. The cameramen are in Liverpool. And when we do the Amazon Games coming up in December, that's how we're going to be doing it. We're going to be having 3 or 4 remote operation centres through the BT Sport facilities, and what the Euromedia Group have done, and what Sky Sports have done as well. The pandemic has accelerated that hugely, and I think that's a great testament to our technical colleagues who pulled all the stops out to make these things happen. Timeline did a great job. We all 3 of us production companies used their facilities during the summer. to do everything, a lot of the productions. So I think in terms of moving forward, the remote production is now here to stay. And that's just going to grow, and it's good for the industry. It makes it, it's much more sustainable. It means we have a lot less of carbon footprint. We don't need so many people going on site. I mean, I think that the rugby final that we produced last month, that Titus and the S&V production team did for BT Sport, I think they had around 78 people on site. Last year it was 148. So, I mean, yes, we had 3 or 4 less cameras, but that was a remote production done with half the amount of people. And I think that's probably one of the big positives that's come out of the pandemic, the acceleration of the remote production distribution centres. And that's probably what the big tick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a good place to end, something positive. It seems like you all have positive outlooks, which is great. That's obviously great for the production community at large in sports production. We've run out of time, unfortunately. So I just want to extend my thanks to our wonderful group of panelists. You've been great, giving your insight of your various companies. So thank you very much for taking time out to do the Broadcast Sport Tech Innovation Forum. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.